Hi everyone. Welcome back to our channel where we don't just tell stories, we bring you into them. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a place and felt like the air changed the moment you arrived? Not because you said a word, not because you did anything wrong, just because of who you are or what you look like. Racism today doesn't always come as a shout. It doesn't always wear a hood or carry a burning torch. More often, it comes as a smirk, a glance, a polite voice that says, "Please step aside." It hides in the small moments that pile up until they weigh on your soul like lead. Some people say times have changed, why dig up the past? Things aren't that bad anymore,
Your invitation
but
seems
others
to be
know
in
the
order, Mr.
truth.
Cross.
When
Please
injustice
step aside,
hides in
sir.
plain
We have other
sight, it
guests
cuts
to
deeper.
attend to.
Because if no one notices,
Your
no
invitation
one
seems to
stops
be in
it.
order, Mr.
So,
Cross.
Please step
where do you
aside, sir.
stand?
We have other guests to attend
Are
to.
you willing to see what so many choose to ignore?
I am Julian
Before we
Cross,
dive into
CEO
today's
and
story,
principal
a
shareholder of
story of
Continental
humiliation
Holdings.
power and a quiet reckoning that left an entire company
I
on
am
its
Julian
knees,
Cross,
make sure to
CEO
like,
and
share,
principal
and
shareholder of
subscribe.
Continental Holdings.
Every click helps us keep telling the stories that others are too afraid to touch. Now, lean in. This one might just change how you see the world. Point 1, the golden morning at Hudson Tower. Hook Mo Jiao. What if the man you just humiliated in front of everyone, the one you treated like he didn't belong, turned out to hold the power to erase your future with a single phone call? At Hudson Tower that morning, no one knew they were about to find out. The morning light spilled across Manhattan like liquid gold, catching on the sleek glass facade of Hudson Tower, the crown jewel of Western Meridian Corp. Inside, the marble lobby gleamed under chandeliers that sparkled like frozen fireworks, casting a glow that made the place feel less like an office and more like a palace. There was a hum in the air, the kind of anticipatory electricity that only comes when millions of dollars and reputations hang in the balance. Today wasn't just another day. It was the final walkthrough before a $700 million expansion deal, a deal touted to make Western Meridian untouchable in the upper echelons of American industry. The city outside was already awake and alive, but in here, the air buzzed with something heavier, something sharper. Investors in bespoke suits lined the velvet-carpeted entrance. Waiters glided past with trays of champagne, their practiced smiles reflecting the weight of the day. An elegant jazz trio played near the towering glass windows, soft notes weaving through the chatter and laughter of people who assumed they belonged. Cameras clicked as the Prescott family pillars of old money prestige posed for a photo near the gold leaf emblem of Hudson Tower. They were everything the event was designed to celebrate wealth exclusivity tradition. No one questioned why they were there. No one ever did. Through the revolving doors came a figure who seemed to draw the morning light with him, though not because of fanfare or applause. Julian Cross stepped into the lobby quietly, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. He stood tall, taller than most, but it wasn't just his height that made heads turn, even if only for a moment. It was his presence. The deep navy suit tailored to perfection, the silver watch gleaming at his wrist, and those eyes steady sharp, unreadable. He didn't walk like someone trying to fit in or prove himself. He walked like someone who already knew exactly where he belonged. But no one here saw that. Not yet. For a moment, Julian paused, taking in the orchestrated opulence. The banners strung across the atrium boasted the company motto, "Excellence through tradition." He watched the way staff practically floated toward the Prescotts with champagne flutes and hushed deference. He watched, too, the sidelong glances flicked his way, the subtle arch of a brow, the quick exchange of looks between two junior associates by the reception desk. He'd seen it all before this quiet calculation, this unspoken question that wasn't about his credentials, but about his complexion. A memory stirred sharp as broken glass. Years ago, a much younger Julian had stood outside a luxury hotel in Boston rain, soaking through his thrift store blazer, as a doorman told him, in no uncertain terms, that the kind of guests we expect didn't arrive looking like him. He'd swallowed the humiliation, then the way he always had, and built himself into a man who could buy the very ground that hotel stood on. That lesson had carved itself into his bones. Never let them see you break, and never ever forget. Now, standing beneath the glittering chandeliers of Hudson Tower, Julian could feel the same test unfolding even before a single word was spoken to him. The whispers, the stares, the faint practiced smile from the platinum-haired receptionist Sloane Pierce, who looked up only to glance past him as though waiting for someone who mattered. Julian adjusted the cuff of his jacket, his movements deliberate calm. Inside, his thoughts were a silent storm, cataloging every detail, the way the red carpet led only toward the VIP elevators, the way the Prescott children tugged on their parents' sleeves, as a photographer snapped away the way no one approached him with a welcome drink or a word of recognition. And yet, despite the quiet chill rolling through the air, Julian's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. Not because he didn't feel the weight of what was coming, he did, but because he knew something no one else in that room could possibly imagine. Every deal inked, every bonus paid, every glimmering promise Western Meridian had made in the past year. All of it sat in the palm of his hand. And while the world here was busy judging whether he belonged, Julian Cross already knew. Before this day was over, they would all find out exactly who did. 2. The Velvet Rope and the Prescott Privilege. Hook Mo Jiao. Sometimes the ropes aren't just velvet. They're walls you can't see built, to keep some people elevated and others quietly erased. At Hudson Tower, Julian Cross was about to be reminded how high and how cold those walls could feel. The hum of polite laughter and clinking glasses filled the grand lobby, a melody of privilege that felt almost orchestrated. The red carpet unfurled like a river of silk, leading toward a bank of frosted glass elevators marked executive access only. Staff members, their uniforms sharp and immaculate, moved with military precision to ensure every important guest felt the kind of attention money and pedigree could buy. And in the middle of it all, Sloane Pierce stood at the reception desk like a gatekeeper wrapped in elegance, her platinum hair wound into a perfect chignon, her lips painted into a smile that never touched her eyes. Julian Cross, still holding his gold-embossed invitation, stepped forward to present it. His expression calm, his posture impeccable. Sloane glanced at the card, her manicured fingers grazing its edge. She could see the seal, unmistakable, the type of access it granted, and yet her brow creased ever so slightly, a tiny wrinkle betraying her thoughts. Her eyes darted up, meeting his for the briefest second before skimming over his shoulder to the doors behind him. "One moment, sir," she said, her voice cool and polite, in a way that wasn't meant to comfort, but to dismiss. Her gaze slid past him as she added, "We have VIP guests we need to process first. Please step aside." The words weren't loud, but they sliced through the lobby's hum like a violin string snapping. Conversations nearby faltered. A few people looked up, curiosity flickering in their eyes, before quickly looking away. Julian, his jaw steady, blinked once slowly. "I have a scheduled meeting with Mr. Radcliffe and the board at 10 o'clock. he said, his voice low, unshaken. Sloane didn't flinch, didn't even glance at the clock mounted above her head. She gestured to the velvet rope along the side of the lobby, her tone clipped and mechanical. Security will assist you shortly. Please wait over there. Before Julian could respond, the heavy glass doors swung open, and the Prescott swept in, trailed by a gust of cold winter air, and the kind of casual confidence that only generations of inherited wealth could teach. Robert Prescott, tall and silver-haired, exuded the charm of a man used to running boardrooms and dinner parties with equal ease. His wife, Evelyn, floated beside him, draped in winter white, while their two children, barely into adulthood, scrolled their phones with the detached ease of people accustomed to being the center of every room. Sloane transformed. Her entire posture softened, her voice rose into a honeyed lilt as she nearly leapt from behind the desk. "Mr. and Mrs. Prescott, welcome, welcome," she gushed, her hands extending as though greeting royalty. No one checked their credentials. No one asked them to wait. A velvet rope was unclipped with a theatrical flourish, and a uniformed attendant appeared almost magically, offering crystal flutes of champagne. The Prescotts glided toward the private elevators, untouched by the obstacles that had so suddenly appeared for Julian. Julian remained where he stood, his invitation still in hand, his expression unreadable, but his presence impossible to ignore. He felt the stares, some pitying, some skeptical, most indifferent. To the staff, he'd become a problem to be managed, an anomaly in a space curated for a very specific kind of guest. Derek Cole, the stocky security guard, whose badge glinted in the chandelier, Light approached with the slow swagger of a man who thrived on moments like this. His eyes narrowed as he scanned Julian from head to polished shoes. "ID, please," he barked. Though Julian had already presented both his government-issued identification and the official invitation. Derek flipped the documents back and forth, scrutinizing them as though expecting a forgery to materialize between his fingers. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And what's your business here today, sir?" he asked, the "sir" dripping with skepticism. The pause between each word was a challenge, a silent dare for Julian to defend his right to stand in the gleaming lobby. Julian's grip on his composure didn't falter. "As I said," he replied evenly, "I have a meeting with Mr. Radcliffe and the board regarding the expansion project. I am expected." His voice carried a steadiness that contrasted sharply with Derek's needling tone, but the security guard only grunted, strolling back to confer with Sloane in low conspiratorial murmurs. Over their shoulders, Julian watched as another guest arrived, a young white man in a rumpled blazer, his boarding pass crumpled in one hand, Bluetooth earpiece blinking like a beacon. He stumbled toward the desk, breathless. Sloane didn't hesitate. Her voice warmed instantly. "Mr. Stanton, we'll get you checked in right away." She ushered him toward the VIP elevator without so much as a glance at his paperwork. It was a choreography Julian knew by heart. The subtle signals, the gatekeeping disguised as procedure, the warmth rationed based on the unspoken equation of status and appearance. And every person in the room was part of the performance, those who executed it, those who benefited, and those like him who were expected to endure it in silence. From a few feet away, Maya Ellis, the newest intern at the desk, sat frozen, her hands trembling as she shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. She'd whispered once quietly that Julian's pass said executive VIP access, but the sharp warning glance Sloane had shot her silenced any second attempt. Now she watched a knot of unease tightening in her chest as Julian was quietly herded toward a cold metal bench near the entrance far from the plush leather seats reserved for those deemed worthy. Julian lowered himself onto the bench with deliberate calm, placing his briefcase beside him and adjusting his cuffs. Across the lobby, Sloane laughed a little too loudly at something Bradley Kane, the branch manager, had said as he strolled toward the Prescotts, his voice booming with artificial charm. The contrast burned, but Julian didn't let it show. Around him, the velvet ropes didn't just mark pathways. They marked the invisible line between who mattered and who didn't. And while every sip of champagne and every chuckle from across the lobby whispered that he was on the wrong side of that line, Julian Cross sat in stillness, his patience unshaken, his resolve sharpening, because he knew what none of them did not yet. The walls they had built around him were about to collapse, and when they did, the fall would be louder than anyone in Hudson Tower could imagine. 3. The Quiet Storm. Power in Silence. Hook Mojao. Some storms announce themselves with thunder and lightning. Others, the most dangerous ones, build in silence unseen until they bring everything crashing down. On that cold morning inside Hudson Tower, Julian Cross was the quiet kind. Timonusatruyen. The air in the lobby had shifted, though no one but Julian seemed to notice. The voices that once blended into a pleasant hum now carried undertones of dismissal, indifference, and the occasional glance that lingered a beat too long. The grand chandeliers overhead glimmered with the same warmth they had an hour ago, but to Julian the glow felt colder now, as though the building itself was conspiring to remind him he didn't belong. He sat on the cold metal bench near the entrance, the seat deliberately placed, apart from the plush leather chairs that lined the VIP area, his briefcase resting neatly at his side. His back was straight, his gaze steady, every movement measured, but beneath the stillness, something was shifting. Julian had spent his life building an empire from the ground up, turning every door that had been slammed in his face into fuel for the next opportunity. He'd been underestimated before countless times, and every time he had learned to keep his rage buried deep, to channel it into precision rather than reaction. Anger, he had come to understand, was a luxury. Power, on the other hand, was a choice. And right now, sitting alone while the world paraded past him in polished shoes and custom suits, Julian chose power. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cold surface of a black tablet. To anyone watching it, might have looked like he was checking a schedule or sending a polite email. In reality, the device was his lever, the switch that could change the entire trajectory of Western Meridian Corp. With a few swift taps, Julian accessed a secure encrypted channel linked directly to his team at Continental Holdings. His fingers paused over the digital keyboard, his expression calm, almost serene, as though he were ordering lunch rather than preparing to halt a $700 million deal. Immediate hold on Hudson Tower expansion. Suspend all negotiations until further notice. Await my direct authorization. The words glowed faintly on the screen. Julian reviewed them, once, then pressed send. There was no flourish, no sound, just a small confirmation icon in the corner of the display before the screen went dark. The decision had been made. Outside the room, where he sat, Hudson Tower hummed with life, blissfully unaware that its most ambitious project, the one every smiling executive and self-important manager had been buzzing about all morning, had just been frozen by the man they had tried to treat like a nuisance. Julian placed the tablet on the bench beside him and folded his hands loosely, his posture still impeccable. He let his eyes drift to the far end of the lobby where Sloane Pierce was leaning over the desk, her laughter sharp and performative as she fawned over Bradley Kane. Bradley, ever the embodiment of corporate arrogance, was holding court near the Prescotts, his voice carrying just enough for others to overhear, as he boasted about the expansion, about the bonuses and promotions it would bring, about the exclusivity Western Meridian had so carefully curated. Julian noted every word, not because he needed to remember them, but because in moments like this observation was its own weapon. In the dim room adjacent to the lobby, the so-called Visitor Services Lounge, where he'd been escorted moments earlier by Grant Harlow's heavy hand, the contrast was even starker. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and carpet cleaner, and the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, incessant hum. The chairs were mismatched, the walls lined with outdated pamphlets. It was a room designed not for hospitality, but for containment, a place to put those who, in the eyes of people like Sloane and Bradley, didn't merit the velvet rope or the champagne flute. Julian didn't flinch at the indignity of it. He'd been in worse places, faced harsher insults, and every one of those moments had shaped him into the man now sitting quietly in a room they assumed would break him. Instead, he let the silence settle his mind, razor sharp, as he began to sketch out the changes he would make once this day ended. The reception and guest services team would be rebuilt from the ground up, not with scripts and fake smiles, but with training rooted in respect, equity, and accountability. Maya Ellis, the only one who had shown even the smallest spark of integrity, would be given the tools and authority to lead that transformation. And Sloane Bradley Grant, Derek, their roles would be reviewed. Every decision they had made today, scrutinized not just for policy, but for principle. Out in the marble lobby, the clock above the desk ticked forward, its soft chime marking the top of the hour. 10 o'clock. Julian's meeting time had come and gone, yet no one approached. No one offered an explanation, and no one even pretended to care. Bradley was laughing now, a sharp bark of amusement punctuating whatever anecdote he was spinning for the Prescotts. The sound echoed faintly through the cracked door to the visitor services room. It didn't sting. It simply hardened Julian's resolve. On another floor, far above the bustling lobby, Victor Langston, the CEO of Western Meridian, was just receiving the alert from Continental Holdings. Julian Cross had frozen the expansion deal. The message was brief, clinical, but the implications were seismic. Victor rose from his desk, without a word, signaling his assistant to clear his schedule as he made his way toward the executive elevator. He knew better than most what Julian's decisions meant, and he knew, too, that Hudson Tower was seconds away from learning the same lesson. Julian stood from the worn chair, smoothing the front of his jacket, and picked up his briefcase. The faint creak of the seat beneath him was the only sound in the musty room as he adjusted his cuffs, the silver of his watch catching the sterile light. There was no anger etched into his face, no satisfaction, just a calm certainty that came from decades of surviving rooms like this one. The storm wasn't coming with raised voices or slammed doors. It would arrive the way Julian always moved, deliberate, undeniable, and devastatingly precise. As he opened the door and stepped back into the polished glow of the Hudson Tower lobby, Julian didn't need to announce what had already been set in motion. The decision had been made. The storm had already begun. And by the time anyone realized the ground beneath them was shifting, it would be far too late to stop it. Part 4. The Reveal. who Julian Cross really is. Hook Mojao, every lie a place tells about who belongs will eventually be shattered by the truth. And on that morning, the truth was about to walk out of the shadows and into the marble light of Hudson Tower. The call came like a crack of thunder, shattering the cultivated calm of the Hudson Tower lobby. The sleek phone on Sloane Pierce's reception desk rang with a tone sharper and louder than the usual polished chimes. The display flashed a name that sent a jolt through her body: Victor Langston, the CEO of Western Meridian Corp. Himself. Her fingers, so steady when dismissing others, trembled as she lifted the receiver. Hudson Tower Executive Reception. "This is Sloane," she said, her voice catching, despite the practiced melody of hospitality. The voice on the other end was calm, but every syllable carried weight like steel. "This is Langston. I need to speak to Julian Cross immediately. Confirm his location." There was no room for questions, no space for excuses. Sloane froze her breath, stalling in her chest. Julian Cross. The man sitting in the dim visitor services room. The man she had casually dismissed, the man Bradley Kane had mocked in full view of interns and VIPs alike. She had treated him like a problem, a blemish on the tower's immaculate image. And now, the CEO himself was demanding to know where he was. Her throat tightened, the words tumbling out in a stammer. I don't see Mr. Cross on the guest list." Her eyes darted toward the far end of the lobby, where the unmarked door stood closed, a quiet reminder of the arrogance that had sent him there. Before she could stumble through another excuse, Langston's voice cut back and colder, every word deliberate. "Julian Cross is the principal investor and majority shareholder of Continental Holdings, the company funding this entire expansion. 30 seconds ago, he issued a directive to halt all negotiations. Now I will ask you one last time, where is he?" The words hit the lobby like a bomb. Conversations died mid-sentence. The clink of crystal glasses stopped. Even the jazz trio's soft melody faltered, a piano chord hanging in the air like a question mark. Bradley Kane, who had been mid-laugh near the Prescott family, went pale, the smug curve of his mouth collapsing into something strained and colorless. The junior managers, who had been drinking in his every boast, now stepped back wide-eyed, as though proximity to him might taint their futures. Sloane's knuckles whitened around the receiver as she muttered something incoherent, her mind scrambling for a way out that didn't exist. All eyes turned slowly, almost unwillingly, toward the far end of the lobby, toward the closed door behind which Julian Cross sat in silence. The very man they had treated like an inconvenience now loomed in their thoughts like a tidal wave they hadn't seen coming. Bradley slammed his coffee down the ceramic cup, shattering against the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the stunned quiet. "Go get him," he barked at Sloane, his voice an octave higher than usual, tinged with the panic of a man watching his carefully constructed image crumble. Sloane stumbled from behind the desk, nearly tripping over a toppled stack of glossy pamphlets. Her heels clattered against the marble, sharp and uneven, as she crossed the expanse toward the dim room where Julian waited. The lobby, so lively moments before, now felt like a cathedral, heavy with the weight of collective shame. Even the Prescotts, who had been sipping champagne and basking in the preferential glow, had gone silent, their practiced smiles faltering as the magnitude of their ignorance settled over them. Inside the visitor services room, Julian heard the hurried approach, the uneven rhythm of panic-driven footsteps, and did not move. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, the subtle glint of his silver watch, catching the flicker of the fluorescent light. His expression was calm, but his presence radiated a gravity that made the cramped, shabby room feel like the center of the universe. When the door burst open, Sloane's voice wavered bright and brittle, betraying the tremor underneath. "Mr. Cross, we are terribly sorry for the misunderstanding. We would be honored to escort you personally to the executive lounge now." "Right this way, sir?" Julian didn't stand immediately. The silence between them stretched thick and unrelenting until she shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Only then did he rise, his movements unhurried, deliberate, each gesture a quiet assertion of control. He picked up his briefcase and stepped past her without a word. She flinched as he brushed by, though he hadn't so much as looked at her. Fear, sharp and tangible, hung in the stagnant air. The lobby froze as Julian emerged, each step echoing sharply against the marble like a metronome counting down to judgment. Conversation ceased entirely. The staff stiffened behind their desks, their fingers hovering uselessly over keyboards. Guests parted instinctively, creating a silent corridor as Julian approached the center of the lobby. Bradley Kane stood near the Prescotts, his face ashen. His confident posture collapsed into something hunched and uncertain. Julian stopped a few feet away from Bradley and Sloane, his gaze sweeping across them not with anger, but with the detached gravity of a man weighing their worth. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the building's ventilation and the ragged breaths of those who knew deep in their bones that they had made a mistake too large to bury. Then Julian spoke, his voice low and even, but carrying through the entire lobby with the weight of inevitability. "You wanted to know who I am." He began, his tone conversational, almost soft, but every word sliced through the brittle quiet. He allowed the silence to stretch to force every ear in the room to lean closer before continuing. "I am Julian Cross, CEO and principal shareholder of Continental Holdings." His gaze shifted, sweeping the chandeliers, the velvet ropes, the gold leaf banners boasting of an expansion no longer guaranteed. "And this," he said, his hand moving in a slow arc to encompass the opulence around them, "this is my project." The reaction rippled outward like a shock wave. Gasps broke the silence. Someone whispered, "That's him." While another voice, tinged with disbelief, murmured, "They made him wait in the back, like some nobody." A woman near the concierge desk shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper, as she said to her companion, "How blind do you have to be?" Bradley opened his mouth, a desperate attempt at salvage forming in his throat. But Julian lifted one hand, a simple gesture that silenced him more effectively than any shout. The air in the lobby thickened the weight of Julian's calm, pressing down harder than fury ever could. Without another word, he resumed walking, cutting through the parted sea of staff and guests like a blade through silk, his presence filling every corner of the space they had once tried to shrink him out of. By the time he reached the bank of VIP elevators, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the chandelier lights and the whispers trailing behind him. They treated him like garbage, someone hissed. "Unbelievable. Heads will roll for this," another muttered. Julian paused briefly, his hand hovering over the control panel, and cast one last glance over his shoulder. His eyes held no rage, no satisfaction, only a cool, unyielding promise. "I see you. I will remember." The heavy elevator doors slid shut behind him with a whisper, leaving the marble expanse in stunned stillness. And as the soft chime of the elevator faded, the storm Julian Cross had carried with him was only just beginning to break. Part 5: Redemption and Renewal at Hudson Tower. Hook Mojiao. When the storm finally passed through Hudson Tower, it didn't just leave ruin, it left room for something new to grow. But redemption, as those who had caused the damage would soon learn, is never given. It's earned, and it comes at a price. Ikurusetin, the aftermath of that morning, rippled through Hudson Tower like a seismic wave, shaking loose the veneer of invincibility that had defined its gleaming lobby. In the hours that followed, Julian Cross's revelation, decisions were swift and merciless, not driven by vengeance, but by the unyielding standards he demanded. Bradley Kane, once the swaggering face of Western Meridian's branch operations, was escorted out before the day was over, a sealed envelope in his hand bearing the company crest. Inside, a termination notice stamped with words that would follow him for years, dismissed for gross misconduct and violations of corporate ethics. It wasn't just a firing, it was a brand, a mark that would shadow his career wherever he tried to rebuild. Sloane Pierce faced her reckoning next. She sat in a glass-walled conference room across from Victor Langston, her composure cracking as he laid out her choices with the precision of a surgeon. Publicly apologize to Julian Cross and accept full responsibility for the morning's debacle, or face a lawsuit that would bankrupt her before it even reached trial. On top of that, Western Meridian would notify every major industry registry that she was barred from any client-facing role for a decade. The mask she had worn so easily behind her polished desk shattered, leaving behind someone who for the first time in years looked small and unmoored. But while those who had let arrogance and prejudice define them faced the fallout, the rebuilding of Hudson Tower began in earnest. Maya Ellis, the young intern whose trembling hands had almost spoken up, was called into Julian's office that very week. She expected a reprimand, perhaps even to be let go in the shuffle that followed the chaos. Instead, Julian looked her in the eye and offered her something she hadn't expected: trust. She would not only remain with the company, but would lead the effort to rebuild the reception and guest services division from the ground up, this time with transparency, respect, and inclusion as its foundation. The girl who had been too afraid to speak would now help ensure no one else would face that fear. Hudson Tower itself underwent a transformation not just of personnel, but of culture. Training programs weren't just compliance checkboxes anymore. They were deep, uncomfortable sessions that forced every level of staff to confront their blind spots. Leadership pipelines shifted, prioritizing empathy and equity over polished pedigrees. Julian made it clear to the board that this wasn't about public relations or damage control. It was about survival. Exclusivity may make a lobby look impressive, he told them during one of the first emergency restructuring meetings. But arrogance will burn this company to the ground. For Bradley and Sloane, redemption came slowly, in ways that stripped away the trappings of the lives they once clung to. Bradley, cut off from the corporate world that had fed his ego, used what remained of his savings to open a modest leadership training center on the outskirts of the city. The building was small, its walls plain, but within them he taught a lesson he had learned the hardest way possible: that leadership meant service, not superiority. He began each seminar with a confession, his voice stripped of the booming bravado that once filled boardrooms. "I'm not here because I succeeded," he would tell every group. "I'm here because I failed spectacularly, painfully, publicly. And I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did." Sloane's path was different, but no less grueling. After her public apology, she withdrew from the glossy world she had built her identity around. For months, she worked quietly with local community organizations, not as a figurehead, but as a volunteer, sweeping floors, organizing food drives, listening to voices she had once dismissed. Slowly, she found something she had never truly possessed before: humility. And as the months became years, she began to speak at schools and nonprofits, not about her downfall, but about the dangerous comfort of complacency and the importance of confronting bias before it consumes you. High above the city, Julian Cross continued his work without fanfare. He didn't seek headlines or grand gestures. His presence alone had reshaped an institution, and now his focus was on ensuring that the change outlasted him. He invested in companies that proved their commitment to fairness, mentored young leaders from every walk of life, and reminded those around him that dignity was never something to be granted. It was inherent, unshakable, and often the quietest kind of power. Hudson Tower no longer gleamed quite the same way it had before. The marble floors were still polished, the chandeliers still sparkled, but beneath the surface, something far more enduring had taken root. The building no longer stood as a monument to exclusion. It had become a place where mistakes were acknowledged, lessons were learned, and change was not just a slogan, but a practice. And in the quiet offices, where decisions were made, the name Julian Cross was no longer a mystery or an afterthought. It was a reminder that power wielded with patience and principle could tear down the walls others built, and in their place create something far stronger. Final and action. Julian Cross's story at Hudson Tower was never just about a morning of humiliation or the collapse of a $700 million deal. It was a story about what happens when quiet strength meets systemic arrogance, and how a single act of integrity, executed with patience rather than rage, can reshape the destiny of an entire institution. From the moment Julian stepped into that glittering lobby, dressed in his tailored navy suit, to the instant he was quietly escorted into a dim visitor's room, as if he were a trespasser, the narrative followed a rhythm many have felt, but few can disrupt the undercurrent of judgment and exclusion that flows beneath places of prestige. Yet Julian was not just another target of that current. He was the tide that would turn it. At every stage, the people around him, Sloane Pierce with her thinly veiled contempt, Bradley Kane with his loud performative arrogance, Derek Cole and Grant Harlow with their heavy-handed enforcement of unwritten rules, believed they were gatekeepers protecting the sanctity of Hudson Tower. They thought Julian was a name on a list that could be delayed, a body to be pushed aside, so that the Prescott family and others like them could glide across velvet ropes without obstruction. They failed to see what sat behind Julian's calm exterior: the authority to hold the future of the building and everyone inside it in the palm of his hand. When the truth unraveled that Julian Cross was the CEO and principal shareholder of Continental Holdings, the architect and financier behind the very expansion, Western Meridian celebrated the shame that spread through that marble lobby was as loud as any alarm. Yet Julian never raised his voice, never lashed out. He didn't need to. His presence, his deliberate movements, and his unwavering calm carried more weight than fury ever could. With a few measured actions, a frozen project, a quiet walk through the stunned crowd, a reminder of who truly held the reins, he dismantled the false hierarchy that had propped up Hudson Tower's arrogance and replaced it with a lesson that would endure far beyond that day. The fallout for those who had humiliated him was swift and unavoidable. Bradley Kane lost his title and is standing forced to confront the emptiness of a career built on exclusion rather than leadership. Sloane Pierce, stripped of her polished facade, was made to confront the human cost of her prejudice and rebuild her life far from the glossy lobbies she once ruled. And yet their stories did not end in ruin. Through humility and hard work, both found paths to redemption. Bradley teaching others that leadership is service, not superiority, and Sloane using her fall as a warning to others about the dangers of complacency and bias. For Julian, there was no victory lap, no public spectacle. His triumph was not in their downfall, but in the transformation of Hudson Tower itself. The building became a place where respect was no longer transactional, where leadership was measured by empathy and integrity, and where a new generation led by people like Maya Ellis could thrive without the shadows of invisible barriers. Julian's story reminds us that dignity is not something granted by titles, appearances, or the approval of gatekeepers. It is inherent, unshakable, and often the most powerful tool we carry. The lesson here is not just for those who might face exclusion, but for everyone navigating a world where judgment and bias often flow quietly beneath the surface. If you've ever felt underestimated, Julian's story is proof that patience and purpose can outlast arrogance. If you've ever held power, it is a warning that using it to elevate some while demeaning others can unravel everything you've built in an instant. True strength lies not in asserting dominance, but in choosing integrity, even when the world tempts you to do otherwise. Carry this lesson into your own life. Stand firm in your worth, no matter who doubts it. Treat every person you meet with the respect you would want in return, even when no one is watching. And remember that the storms worth surviving and the changes worth making rarely come from rage, but from the quiet resolve to do what's right no matter the cost. If Julian Cross's story resonated with you, and you want to see more powerful narratives that reveal hard truths, inspire change, and remind us of our shared humanity, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that matter, and the next one might just be the spark you need to see the world differently.